Welcome to this data analytics tutorial that covers contribution margin ratio, and segment margins using pivot tables and charts in Excel. In this activity, we are using a sales and cost data set for a fictitious company, Cabinet Accessories Company, CAC. The sales and cost data covers a multi-year period. For this tutorial only, we are using a small 36 record data set. For the actual activity, you will be using the full data set, so the answers for the activity requirements will be different, but the process will be similar. For this tutorial on pivot tables and pivot charts, we will be demonstrating using Office 365 Excel for Windows. Other versions of Excel may be slightly different. Also note that there may be many ways of accomplishing the same thing. We are just presenting one way here. Make sure your version of Office 365 is updated. You may not see things the same way if you have not updated recently. Again, please be sure to update your version of Excel before working on the project. Certain features will not work if you are not using the most current version of Excel. Start this activity by opening the Excel workbook containing the dataset. You will be using the Excel file provided to create pivot tables and other data. Step-by-step instructions using the tutorial dataset follow for each of the requirements for the assignment. Requirement 1 asks, create 3 columns in the data worksheet that calculate sales revenue, variable cost, and contribution margin for each sales record. For the first step in this first requirement, go to cell K2 in the data worksheet, which is the cell under the column heading Sales Revenue. Enter the formula for sales revenue, which is equals H2 times J2, and press Enter. Point to the cells rather than typing them in. For the second step, click in cell L2, which is right below the column heading Variable Cost. Enter the formula for variable cost, which is equals I2 times J2. Again, point to the cells rather than typing in the names. For the third column, click in cell M2, which is the cell right below the column heading of contribution margin. Enter the formula for contribution margin, which is sales revenue minus variable cost, or equals K2 minus L2. Again, point to the cells rather than typing them in. There is a lot less potential for error that way. In the fourth step, copy the 3 formulas down to the rest of the rows by selecting the 3 cells and then double-clicking the fill handle, which is the small box in the lower right-hand corner of cell M2. For step 5, format the 3 columns by selecting the columns, and then on the Home tab, click Accounting Format. The default for accounting format is 2 decimal places, and that is what we want. Requirement 1 is complete. We have added 3 formatted columns to the data worksheet. Requirement 2 states, create a pivot table that shows sales revenue by region for each year. Correct any errors in the data set. Insert a pivot chart to show sales trends. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the pivot table icon. Next, to accept the default range and open a new worksheet, click OK. Double-click the New Worksheet tab to activate it and rename it Requirement 2. That will help to keep track of the different pivot tables. By the way, if the Pivot Tables field panel ever disappears, you can bring it back by clicking anywhere in the pivot table you have created. The next step is to click and drag Region in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Rows box. Select Revenue and drag it down to the Values box, and Date of Sale drag down to the Columns box. Your results should show years in the column headings. If your pivot table shows individual dates, with day, month, and year, follow the instructions on the next slide. If your columns do not group by year, follow the steps on this slide. Right-click on the first column's date. In this example, that is cell B4, and select Group. In the grouping dialog box, select Years. Click OK. Now back to everyone. The next step is to examine the pivot table, looking for errors. Here we see that Central has been entered as Centrals at least once in the dataset. When you work on a large assigned dataset, there will be many different errors, but the same visual inspection technique will work to find any errors. Navigate to the data worksheet. On the Home tab, click Find and Select. In the menu, click Replace. In the Find and Replace dialog box, type the text you are searching for, Centrals, in this example, in the Find What field. Then, in the Replace With field, type the new text. Click Replace All. Excel will return a message box with the number of replacements that were made. Repeat Find and Replace until all of your dataset errors are fixed. For the next step, return to the Requirement 2 worksheet. Click in the data in the pivot table. Right-click and select Refresh. This process will update the pivot table so that the errors you corrected are no longer in the pivot table. Next, we will format the data in the pivot table. Select the pivot table data and right-click to select Number Format. In the Format Cells dialog box, click Accounting and then click OK. Now we are going to insert a pivot chart in this same worksheet. Select the pivot table data and the region row labels. Do not select the grand total data. On the Insert tab, click Pivot Chart. In the Insert Chart dialog box, click on the clustered column chart and click OK. In your new chart, click one of the gray field buttons on the chart, and in the menu, click Hide All Field buttons on Chart. Requirement 2 is complete. We created a pivot table that shows sales revenue by region for each year. We corrected errors in the data set, and we inserted a pivot chart to show sales trends. Requirement 3 reads, create a pivot table that shows sales revenue, variable costs, and contribution margin for each year. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. Next, on the Insert tab, click the pivot table icon. To accept the default range and open a new worksheet, click OK. Double-click the new worksheet and rename it Requirement 3. In the next step, drag Years and Region in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Rows box. Drag Sales Revenue, Variable Cost, and Contribution Margin down to the Values box. Now, to format the data, select the data in column B for sales revenue, right-click and select Number Format. Next, in the Format Cells dialog box, click Accounting and then click OK. Repeat the formatting steps for variable cost data and for contribution margin data. Those steps are to select the data and right-click, select Number Format, and then select Accounting. Requirement 3 is complete. We created a pivot table that shows sales revenue, variable costs, and contribution margin for each year for each region. Requirement 4 reads, create a pivot table that shows the most profitable brand in each year, as measured by contribution margin. Click anywhere in the data worksheet. On the Insert tab, click the pivot table icon. To accept the default range and open a new worksheet, click OK. Double-click the new worksheet tab and rename it Requirement 4. Now drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Columns box. Drag Brand down to the Rows box. Drag Contribution Margin down to the Values box. Next, select the pivot table data and right-click. Select Number Format, and then Format as Accounting. Requirement 4 is complete. We created a pivot table that shows the most profitable brand in each year, as measured by contribution margin. Requirement 5 reads, within each brand, what was the most profitable collection in 2025, as measured by contribution margin ratio? We will need to use the field years to filter the data to include just the year of 2025. We will also need to add a calculated field to the pivot table to calculate the contribution margin ratio. And then within each brand, we will sort the collections by contribution margin ratio from largest to smallest. The first step is to click anywhere in the data worksheet. On the Insert tab, click the pivot table icon. Accept the default range and open a new worksheet. Click OK. Double-click the new worksheet and rename it Requirement 5. Now drag Years in the Pivot Table Fields panel down to the Filters box. Drag Brand and then Collection down to the Rows box. Finally, drag Contribution Margin down to the Values box. Next, on the Pivot Table Analyze tab, click Fields, Items, and Sets. And in the menu, click Calculated Field. For the next step, in the Insert Calculated Field dialog box, type CM ratio in the name field. Then, in the formula box, add the formula equals contribution margin divided by sales revenue. Remember to point to the fields and click Insert Field after each, rather than typing them in. Click Add, and then click OK. Select the data in the Sum of Contribution Margin column and right-click. Select Number Format. In the Format Cells dialog box, select Accounting and click OK. Select the data in the Sum of CM Ratio column and right-click. Select Number Format. In the Format Cells dialog box, select Percentage and click OK. Just like the accounting format, the default for percentage format is 2 decimal places, and that is what we want. In the next step, click the Years filter icon, and in the menu, select 2025, and then click OK. Click on a cell in the pivot table for CM ratio at the collection level. Here we will click on cell C5. Next, right-click and select Sort, and then click Sort Largest to Smallest. Requirement 5 is complete. We can see the most profitable and least profitable brands as measured by contribution margin ratio. Requirement 6 reads, complete the worksheet named Segment Margin. You will calculate each region's segment margin and operating income for 2025. You will link to the totals in the pivot table you created for Requirement 3. You will get fixed costs for calculating the segment margins from the Fixed Cost Data worksheet. Go to the Segment Margin worksheet. We will work through filling in the segment margin report, beginning with the central region. Type an equal sign in cell B4. Next, link to the sales revenue total in the pivot table from Requirement 3 by pointing to the relevant cell in the Requirement 3 pivot table and pressing Enter. Now for cell B5, type an equal sign. Next, link to the variable cost total in the pivot table from Requirement 3 by pointing to the relevant cell in the Requirement 3 pivot table and pressing Enter. Moving on to cell B6, calculate the contribution margin using the formula equals B4 minus B5. Remember to point to the cells rather than typing them in to ensure accuracy. In cell B5, link to the direct fixed expense for the central region by typing an equal sign and then pointing to the relevant cell in the fixed cost data worksheet. Now in cell B8, calculate the segment margin using the formula equals B6 minus B7. In cell B9, link to the common allocated costs for the central region by typing an equal sign and then pointing to the relevant cell in the fixed cost data worksheet. Calculate operating income or loss in cell B10 using the formula equals B8 minus B9. Repeat the previous steps for each of the remaining regions. You can copy most of the formulas, but you cannot copy cells that refer to pivot tables. Any cells that point to the numbers in the pivot table in requirement 3 will each need to be linked individually rather than copied from another cell in the worksheet. In this tutorial, we have only 3 regions in the mini dataset with 2025 data: Central, East Coast, and South. When you use the full dataset, you will have data in every column. There are 8 regions in the full dataset. Now sum each of the rows in the total of all regions column. Start each sum with an equals sign, sum, and then point to the cells you are adding. Requirement 6 is complete. We can see the segment margin and operating income for each of the regions. Remember, there are only 3 regions with data from 2025 in this tutorial set, but you will have all 8 regions in the full data set. That concludes this data analytics tutorial covering contribution margins, contribution margin ratios, and segment margins using Excel pivot tables and charts. This video was created by Dr. Wendy Tietz. Thanks for watching.